Alright, let's get caught back up on a few of the newer releases, and I think I want to start with Weird, the Al Yankovic story, which is something that I love Weird Al, and I've always, grown up with his stuff, especially through my brother and his friend. There's still songs of his that I haven't heard in maybe 15 years that I still have memorized. Like I could sit in front of this camera right now and probably tell you every word to Albuquerque, the 11.5 minute ode that this movie feels a lot. It almost kind of feels like a feature-length version of this as far as giving him this sort of fictional life. Only this one obviously is a bit more going into the parody of biopics, which for starters is going to immediately bring to mind something like Walk Hard. But the thing about that is that, and I hope I don't start an angry mob or anything like that. I never really cared that much for Walk Hard, and I've always found it pretty overrated. But the other thing going into this is that it was built up pretty quickly what exactly this was going to be, which was something like that, where it wasn't going to be an actual biopic, but more of like a, much in Weird Al fashion, just a giant parody of one, while incorporating real life elements into it, just using those as jumping off points to go into something completely absurd in the best way. And my initial concern going into this, because of that, was that this was built up so much. Like, when the details started coming out that Daniel Radcliffe was going to be, like, jacked, which was a joke in itself, and all that other stuff, it felt like the novelty of what this movie was doing was kind of gone before it even came out, because so many people were building up, like, oh, it's going to be so completely not his actual life, or whatever, and go completely off the path. But because Weird Al and his co-writer and the director of this movie are so talented, that even with that novelty kind of already being out in the open before you even go in, because I really wish this is something we've been able to go into, like, completely blind. Like, if it only been built up, it was going to be a biopic, and we didn't know anything else, and then it just came out, which would have been easy to do because of the way it's streaming, just for free, it's just out there. But yeah, the marketing kind of went all in, and I also think that kind of goes against this whole idea that Weird Al has a lot of respect for his audience, and he tends to know that, or he tends to trust that people will be in on his jokes also. So, yeah, but I do like the fact that that ended up not stopping the movie from being as funny as it is, or being able to go all in on its concept as much as it does. Because even so, there's still ways that I was surprised, where, like, the way subplots would take off and what exactly the catalyst for those subplots would be, was always surprising anyway. Starting with the fact that you've only ever really heard him say good things about his parents, so I love their portrayal here by Toby Huss and Julian Nicholson. Uh, where they're the kind of stereotypical biopic parents, where they're kind of against everything he does. One more so openly than the other, because Toby Huss really brilliantly does this thing where he's the one that thinks, like, everything that he does is evil, and it's gonna put him down the wrong path when he needs to be working at the factory, which is intentionally generic in the best ways, the whole factory setup, but the way he talks about changing words to songs being confusing and evil, and referring to the accordion as the devil's monstrosity. And it's like the more over the top he would go, the funnier it would get. And Toby Huss is an actor that can go over the top and knows exactly what to do with it, to make sure he hits just the right note without going too far, but can still go very far regardless. But what I really love also about what Nicholson's doing is that she's supposed to be kind of like, the quiet parent that, like, secretly supports him and stuff like that, but she has this way of, like, sounding really tender and having, like, a really loving tone, but also just ripping his dreams to shreds through that tone. And so the whole setup and the whole idea of them setting up him being like a teenage character and then going to parties, and what would typically be, getting drunk or doing drugs or whatever, is going to a polka party, and that's his, like, rebellion stage. And it's like the idea that that's what all the cool kids are doing. Which is a funny joke, but it also is like, this is the same year that we had Halloween Ends, where the school bullies are the band geeks, and it's almost like it almost makes this joke even funnier that Halloween Ends exists, because it just shows how fucking stupid that whole thing in Halloween Ends was. Was that it's a parody that this is where the cool kids are, obviously. In the way, like, the accordion itself personifies, like, a drinking and drugs aspect of a typical teenager's life or whatever, like, to the point that the cops have to break up this polka party. And it's like, the jokes like that are here just long enough to where, because the worst thing that could have happened in a movie like this is the jokes running themselves into the ground. And there were a couple of cases where I actually thought that was happening, and it wasn't until, in retrospect, like, after I had finished the movie and, like, hours later, I was thinking about it, and I was realizing more how well the jokes work. Even the ones that feel like they might be kind of dragged out, I feel like actually might go at just the right length to make their point and be funny. And be funny for the reason that they really pushed how long they were willing to go with certain jokes. And how skillful it actually is all put together. And another thing that I talk about a lot with musical biopics is how much I love... My favorite part, always, of musical biopics is watching the songs be built. That's why I liked Bohemian Rhapsody as much as I did, because of how much time was devoted just watching them make the songs. And it's like, that's what I really love these kind of biopic things for, because obviously, yeah, there is the whole thing where they're all really cliche, they all kind of go down the same path, and they're all repetitive, but... and they all almost kind of feel like the next one feels like a rip-off of the previous one, and so on. But here, taking the idea of the whole building the song concept, where we get, like, him realizing the origins of My Bologna and then performing it, but still doing it, like I said, there's the real-life elements that they just kind of take to the next level of parody, where it was, like, the fact that he did record My Bologna in a bathroom. I think it was a bathroom of, like, a radio station. And here they up it to the bathroom of a bus station to make it seem even more as low as he could go to get to this point, to get to this high point. And stuff like that, like those little tweaks where you kind of know what the real thing is probably going to help a lot. But I feel like even if you don't know, there's still, like, there's just still the joke about the fact that he, in the movie, records the song in a bus station bathroom is still a joke that stands on its own, even if you don't know that that's pretty close to the actual origin of that song. There's also a scene towards the end when he's at, like, his parents' dinner table where they subvert this, where it sounds like he's coming up with a song, and then they just kind of shoot it down, which is also funny. And they also... what almost seems to be a direct parody of Mike Myers actually being in Bohemian Rhapsody and being the one that tries to shut down the song Bohemian Rhapsody, saying it'll never, where it felt like this weird parody moment in a movie that was actually a biopic, where Mike Myers is saying people won't be headbanging to Bohemian Rhapsody in their cars, when obviously Wayne's World repopularized that song. And to take that to the extra level here, it's actually Weird Al playing that part in this. The, record executive that turns him down and gives him the harsh advice and stuff like that. Alongside Will Forte. Will Forte, who obviously has long since perfected playing overly confrontational in a hilarious way. Will Forte is such a criminally overlooked genius. I hate that he's not, like, more in the spotlight than he is. So I love seeing him being able to get parts like this where he gets to really play to his strengths. And a part that could have just been a cameo, but he ends up being just as memorable as really anybody else. And going forward also on these biopic points where the character's eventually going to have to break out, we get this sort of Boogie Nights style party with cameos galore. And I love that there's a layer to when you say there's cameos in this scene, because typically when there's a lot of cameos in, like, one scene or something, or even just in a movie in general, you're kind of like trying to point out who's who, like, oh, I know that person, I know that person. And there's an extra layer to this because now it's people that you recognize in random cameos playing certain big figures in pop culture and entertainment and all that other stuff. So it's like you're pointing out the actors that you know and the characters that you recognize that were actually entertainers of the time. So that seems super fun. And then obviously that's sort of his big jumping off point. And then we go into the obvious biopic stuff about alcoholism and drugs and stuff like that. And the way they sort of go headfirst into this and also around it is quite funny. Because this is one of the points I was talking about where it's like, it almost feels like the movie might get stuck and it goes too far into one joke and drags something out a little too long. But because that's the thing is, like, once you've made the joke that he goes into, like, alcoholism, then narratively you get stuck there. You get stuck in that joke, and you have to kind of find your way out. And so there's the scene where, like, he gets drunk and he breaks down on stage. And it's like, while I was watching it, I was like, yeah, okay, so they got stuck in the alcoholism joke, and they didn't know how to get out of it. But then, like I said, hours later, I'm thinking back to this scene, and it's like, well, the funny thing is that he breaks down on stage and has his big alcoholism, has his Bradley Cooper in A Star Is Born moment while he's playing like a surgeon. And it's like, that's what it kind of took a minute to set in, where it's like, think about what he's doing in this scene exactly. And it's not just that he's falling into the alcoholism cliche, and through the writer's part, that's on purpose. But it's like the fact that he's trying to perform like a surgeon in that song, in particular, and it's like this is where you can kind of start appreciating, and it's like you could tell that they probably knew when they were going to get stuck in a narrative and how they were able to put things in there that still enriches it and makes it just as funny as it goes. Like, it doesn't lose the joke, or it kind of adds one more layer to the joke. So I can really appreciate that also. And just in general, the way it kind of goes into the layers and directions of parody in general. Like the whole idea of them, like, of artists getting that bump when Weird Al would do one of their songs or parody one of their songs, and just making that an entire plot point, particularly with the Madonna stuff. Who's Evan Rachel Wood is one of my favorite people, and this is certainly making that even more so. It's like, is it Julia Garner that's playing Madonna, like, for real soon? And it's like, it's interesting that it's gonna have to, like, live up to this parody of Madonna that Evan Rachel Wood has already done. Though I'm sure Julia Garner will be fine, because she's also amazing. But, yeah, the whole bump thing being a plot point, and then also another plot point that it goes on for a while, being something that starts from a throwaway joke. Where it's like, just on TV, just kind of seemingly at random, there's a reference to him turning down doing Pablo Escobar's birthday party or something. And you think it's just a throwaway joke. And I remember, like, kind of chuckling at it when it went by, thinking it wouldn't really play any other part in this. It was just a throwaway joke. And then the whole Pablo Escobar thing becomes the plot for a while. But in this really amazing way, where it starts to kind of intentionally, it brings us back to, like, UHF, where he's just kind of going through the genres, and that it actually becomes an action movie for, like, 15 or 20 minutes, and how that even kind of works. And because it always finds its way back to the musical biopic, where it's like, it never goes down a path and then loses its way. It's like the jokes themselves, where it's like, just when they're on the cusp of, like, losing you, and you're like, why don't you come back to this now and not get too distracted by whatever it is you're doing. And no, they always come back, and the fact that when they do come back, it's even funnier because of how far they went another direction, and then they just have to come right back, is very, very funny. And then that basically propels us into what is the inevitable conclusion, where there's actually some surprisingly, genuinely heartwarming moments. There's a moment with Toby Huss especially that I thought was gold, because it actually made me feel something. where obviously they're going to have the big reconciliation and his dad's going to accept him. We're going to get his dad's whole backstory, which was the origin for another Weird Al song in this universe. And they have their big reconciliation moment. So then at the end, Weird Al's at an awards ceremony, and the first thing he says on TV is like, "Yeah, suck it, Dad. Like, eat this." And and we cut to Toby Huss, and he like has this actual like genuine confusion on his face because it's like they just reconciled, and it's like it's so brief, but it's so perfect, and it's like the fact that I actually felt bad for him makes it even funnier. And then that takes us into the ending, into the end credits, and I loved that I didn't see this ending coming, and then and then how seriously it takes this ending. Of course, being fully aware that how seriously it takes it is what the joke is. That's I love the ending so much, and I love the fact also because I saw this a while back now. I'm only just now getting around to it, but since then I've seen like some Weird Al discourse lately where they're not even talking about the movie, they're talking about Weird Al, and references to this movie are already making their way like forever into the Weird Al vernacular when you're talking about him. When you say like, Weird Al did this in real life and did this in real life, and then somebody else like, oh, and he also did this thing, and it's one of the outlandish things from the movie. And it's like that's gonna basically like he's basically created his own hilarious lore through this. Like that's the joke of the movie in general, but the fact that it seems to be sticking and is gonna carry on, and of course that's being able to do something and then make it stick is obviously Weird Al's thing, given how long his career's gone on for what it is that he does. Because the thing about it also is just how talented he is. Kind of comes through in this movie also, where like it's all a parody of what he does. But the fact that Weird Al has such a staying power and is still just as big as he's ever been, really speaks volumes about what he can do and how it does kind of transcend just being parody. Because there's a whole joke in the movie where he wants to start writing original songs, that goes in a very funny direction, and then that's when you remember that he already does have plenty of original songs. Like maybe, some of the beats might be vaguely a parody of something else, or it might be, referencing something else, but at the end of the day, he has quite a few songs that are, like, genuinely original. So I feel like this tackles all that territory, while also doing it in the truest Weird Al fashion. And that's... So this pulled this off in a way that I kind of wasn't... Like I said, when I went into it, I had thought the novelty had already worn off, but I probably should have known better because he's much more talented than that, and of course was able to pull off the execution that this movie has, which was obviously going to be the most important to this concept, and that works. Maybe every now and then there's a joke that might go a little too long, but they're very few and far between. The only one that really comes to mind is Thomas Lennon at the beginning, when he's laying on the ground choking on his own blood, kind of went on a little longer than it probably should have, but I said for the most part it knows exactly how far its jokes should go, and like I said, the fact that some of the jokes may be overlong seems very intentional, and that's kind of the point. And like I said, when they have to come back from that, it makes all of it even funnier. So, yes, this was super entertaining, and also, like, fast-paced also. Like, I was kind of concerned about the length, being, like, close to an hour 50. Seemed pretty long when I was starting, especially for this kind of movie, but, I feel like they handled their time really well there, so, that's pretty much how I feel about that. So, to go on to Enola Holmes 2... talking more about surprises, but also expectations being in a certain place. I remember going into the first movie, and I'm pretty sure I talked about it on here also. Was that, like, just a couple of years ago? And I went into that movie, the first movie, not really having really any expectations, I guess. Because I wasn't even really that familiar with Millie Bobby Brown, because I've only seen the first season of Stranger Things, and it just kind of went in and out to me. I never got into it. So her as an actress, I wasn't really familiar with. There was the the Godzilla movies, but even that, she's not really, you know, those don't require much out of her. So I never really got much of a vibe of her until the first of these movies. And I remember there was something so instantly charming about this. Like, I remember being surprised quickly how much I was able to get into the first Enola Holmes, and the whole concept of her, like, you know, how we're constantly present with her and she's constantly sort of breaking the fourth wall, even in like mid action scenes, or when she's like almost being drowned by villains, she's still breaking the fourth wall to us. And it's like, I feel like it speaks volumes that my memory of that movie is pretty vivid when I've only seen it that one time. Because movies like that, especially Netflix movies, can tend to just sort of come and go and you'll forget about them. But there was just something so effortlessly charming about that first movie and her performance that the movie ended up standing out to me. I even remember some of the action in it, like the scene where they're almost drowning her, or the sort of shootout they have with Baron Gorman towards the end. Her relationship with Carter, even though it was mostly in flashback, and it's sort of half in flashback here, but there's still her and Carter moments are still really strong here. Also, like how Carter just kind of pops in and out of the movie, and typically it'd be one of those things where you would see it as like, you could see a criticism being like, oh, Carter's barely in this movie and she just randomly pops in and out and it's not satisfying enough. But the fact that that's basically the character, that she just kind of pops in and out of Enola's life, but always in this big impactful way, like it never feels like she's wasted when she's here, Carter, which is really great also. And the way that she's able to bring her huge personality to just these sort of bits in the movie. They feel like little explosions every time, quite literally also, whenever Carter appears. And just seeing her build her relationships throughout it also, because I think, because when the movie first started, it did give us, like, you know, a creative sort of recap of the first movie, and then as it shows, like, her experience being questioned, where it's like she'll try to get a job, and then somebody will say, oh, but, you know, can you do this, or do you have experience in this, because you're so young and you're a girl and you don't seem like it. And then the answer to does she have experience would be to cut to a scene from the first movie showing her doing that thing and doing it well. And that's a great way to recap the first movie that doesn't feel too obvious. But I was concerned that this one wasn't going to have the sustainable energy of the first one, because I remember, like I said, the first one being like immediately hooking and then just going from there and feeling like it was kind of nonstop. And like I said, because there was a sort of novelty to that about like what the concept was and the fact that she was always talking to us, and how maybe the novelty had kind of worn off. But as it went on, I kind of stopped caring about that. And it was like, and I kind of got back, like, wrapped back up in its charm. And I think her performance probably has a lot to do with that, I imagine. On top of, you know, the writing and how, you know, the editing in particular comes into play a lot also. But even so, you could, you know, glorify this visually all you wanted, but if her performance wasn't on point, it still wouldn't work, even with, you know, being technically good. So all of it working together, I do think plays a big part in the charm of these movies and the way that they can pull you back in. Even though I had my reservations as it was going on, it's like, because it didn't feel as energetic at first. But then when I stopped worrying about, you know, the novelties of the first movie carrying over, where it was like, it doesn't really need novelties now because it's established itself and it's established her as a character, and that's what the draw is now, and the characters around her and her relationships with them and stuff like that. Especially Henry Cavill feels like he's much more present in this one. And the great thing that they do here is that because Henry Cavill is more present in this one, you would think, oh, is it taking the spotlight off of Enola and becoming a Sherlock movie? And I feel like it never even comes close to having that problem. Because whenever he's here, there are those moments where he, like, and they're used for comedic purposes, where he figures out something very, very quickly that it took her, like, a whole series of steps to do. So it shows that he's still, like, the superior detective, but it's not, there's really a whole sort of point to this story about the fact that she's not at his level, but also the fact that she doesn't really have to be able to do her job well. And the way they handle that and Sherlock's whole inclusion in this story is so surprisingly well done. That's another thing where it was like, it was kind of starting to set in retrospect how well done this was. And it's like, this is stuff that I wasn't really noticing because I was too worried about, it having the novelties of the first movie or whatever. Which was blinding me to what all the other things it was doing so well, especially being a sequel. And being able to use that first movie as the jumping off point and doing this whole, now that everything's been established and how they're going to use these characters that we've already been introduced to now and what they can further do with that. Because oftentimes, when you have a sequel with this many supporting characters, people are going to kind of start taking a back seat and it's going to be like, oh, they're only here because they were in the first one and they don't really serve a purpose now. But everybody serves their purpose in a big way, and Enola always feels like the star at the end of it. And that's something that I feel like pretty much any other sequel would fuck up. And this one does it really well. So, and there's still those moments. Like, there's still moments where she breaks the fourth wall, and it still feels, like, funny and fresh. Like, when her love interest in the first movie returns, and there's this whole moment where she has a chance meeting with him in, like, a park, and your first thought is like, oh, well, what are the odds? And then, obviously, because she can talk directly to us, we learned that it was not exactly as chance as it looked. And stuff like that, where it's able to subvert this stuff, where you think it's going in one direction and you think it's falling into a trap, but it knows what it's doing. So, it's weird how much it feels like there's parallels to this and weird about how well they execute their concepts, but here we are. And there's also, like, and it's always those little moments, like, she can just have, like, just the smallest delivery, that's just so funny. Like, when she prepares to go to a masked party, and until she learns that it's not a masked party, and that was a whole big part of her ruse, was that it was a masked party, but how quickly she's able to just change plans. And how they're able to show how good she is at her job through that, while also making it like a funny, like a comedic bit on top of that. So that's really well done. Also, another thing this one does that I thought was unexpected, that also felt like it could have been a kiss of death in a weaker movie, is incorporating real life history. Because this could have gone wrong in a number of ways. For starters, it could have seemed kind of pointless or potentially tasteless, given how it could have been done. Because there's been a lot of movies that are clearly fictional that incorporate real life that aren't so tasteful, and especially given whatever the subject matter might be. But there's also the case that it could have been really forced. And felt really out of place, or like maybe there would be a tonal problem here, to go from the upbeat nature of the movie to this very serious subject, but the way it incorporates this real life thing into the mystery and into the story, when real life comes in and out of this movie, it's surprisingly seamless, while also handling the subject itself with actual respect, I guess you could say. As far as, like, being a mystery, there were moments where it maybe didn't feel like it was quite reaching its potential, and there are some cases where it felt a bit obvious. Like, this movie is very quick to set up red herrings and then out them as soon as possible. Like, as soon as somebody's set up to be a red herring, you, like, kind of immediately know they're just a red herring. It's one of those cases where it's like, because of how far into the movie you're like, oh, this person they're clearly building up to be the villain is clearly not going to be the villain. We're not going to figure it out in, 45 minutes in. And they do that for a while, where it's like, oh, this person's the villain, oh, they're not. Oh, this person's definitely the villain. And it's like, oh, no, they're not. And after a while, it's just like, you just assume nobody's the villain. But on top of that, though, this does bring us to a very strong climax where everything comes together. And this is also one of those cases where I feel like the climax and the ending in general kind of fix a lot of the problems along the way, which is something that a good mystery would do, where it's like, once you can kind of fill in the holes and be like, oh, I guess this is why this was, and this is why this was. And it's like, oh yeah, it makes sense that this person seemed like they were going to be the villain, and this person and all that. Um, they also use David Thewlis very well, because it was one of those... David Thewlis is one of those characters especially where it was like, it felt like they were going in a very obvious direction, and it's almost as obvious as it seems, but still not quite yet. There's still maybe a few things up the movie sleeve when you think it might be done. And some of them might seem infuriatingly simple. Like you might... like you might have moments where it's like, oh yeah, that is so ridiculous, I totally should have seen that coming, but you have to give the movie credit when it's due. And I didn't. So, there's that. And there's moments, especially like in this, like I was surprised by how well the climax actually works, because it was one of those cases where it felt for a while like, how many endings are we gonna have exactly? You know what it was reminding me of a lot? The last like 20 minutes or so was the end of the first Fantastic Beasts movie. Like structurally, it felt a lot like it, because there is the climax, and there's who you think is the villain, and then there's a big reveal, and like kind of a bit of a speech moment, and then that's taken care of, and then there's still a bit of movie left when everything seems to have been wrapped up. But like I said, the other ending is when this kind of goes into that real life territory, and feels like this really respectful sort of representation of what was going on here and what the whole point of the movie was. And once again, further bringing to point the mystery of what was going on here exactly. And it all comes together, not just that they put together a good mystery, but they can have the emotional impact that it does. It's something that really caught me off guard. So, yeah, I can really appreciate that. So, and I guess if there's one more criticism I had to throw out, it would be that, and I guess you could throw this up to being intentional, but it feels like the action scenes in many cases are heavily inspired by Guy Ritchie's Holmes movies. Like I said, that could be on purpose, but it almost stands out in a distracting kind of way. But overall, it's just hard to not be charmed by this. Like, it's very hard to try to dislike this, and you don't want to try to dislike anything, let alone something that works as well as this does. So, I'm really surprised how much... because the thing about this also is, there is a mid-credits scene, and typically, when this kind of mid-credits scene happens, it's sort of like, oh, great, so they're going to keep this going, or they think they're going to keep this going, and it's like, oh yeah, this obvious thing. But, no, when the mid-credits scene hit, it was like, it's weird. I'm not usually that person that craves franchises. Like, I'm not that person that, like, goes into a movie saying, this desperately needs a sequel, this desperately needs to be franchised. I'm just really a beginning, middle, end kind of person, usually. But, yeah, if this is going to continue to be a franchise, and it can keep up this quality, I'm kind of psyched about that. I was kind of psyched by the mid-credits scene. So, yeah. So if they're going to continue... because I know there's a whole series of books, so if they're going to continue to do that and adapt these, and at this quality, and with Millie Bobby Brown kind of keeping her commitment, and keeping this performance like where it is, and being able to continue to find the layers of this character, this could be a really great franchise, and I'm looking forward to seeing if it can continue to do that and succeed. So, yeah. So, let's go ahead and end on Causeway. Causeway is Jennifer Lawrence going back to indie territory, low-key indie territory, where she kind of pretty much, broke out in a big way with Winter's Bone. Got her first Oscar nomination that way. And it does seem like once, she got into the Hunger Games and got franchised and stuff like that, her performances got bigger and bigger and more over the top. A lot of people seem to forget that Winter's Bone happened. So, it is a nice... it feels like it's kind of her coming back to her roots as far as what really got her going in the business, coming back to something like this. But I just got to say something about Causeway in particular, real quick, before we kind of go into anything else. And that is something I'm not proud to say, but sometimes just shit happens. There will be times where I watch movies like Causeway. They're obviously extremely indie in their nature, extremely low-key and downplayed, and it'll set up like this very real world, and you can get pretty sucked into it immediately. Like, it can grab you pretty much instantly. As you see somebody just kind of go through their life step by step, but very individual, precise steps of their life. And that can be very engaging and very intriguing, just watching somebody live, almost like you're eavesdropping. Sometimes that's how I feel about movies like Causeway. Then there's also times where I watch movies like Causeway and I'm in a more cynical mood. And so it's like I watch this and it's like it feels slow and it feels painfully indie, and it's like as Lawrence is doing these very small activities very slowly, with the help of Jane Houdyshell in these opening scenes, I'm just in my head I was getting cynical and I was thinking like I can just hear the critical acclaim. I can just hear the critics yelling at the screen, the subtleties, you know, the realness, the commitment, the quiet moments, and it's like and it feels so obvious. And that's how I was kind of feeling about the opening scenes of Causeway, and it's like I wasn't feeling drawn into this kind of thing like I have been in other movies that are this low key. I saw one person who didn't like it. And the way they described it was low key to the point of non-existence, and that was striking more with me than, you know, it's like it's just it felt so surface. It felt like surface level, quote, quiet moments to me throughout it, and the fact that it's so relentlessly slow paced despite being only an hour and a half. Once Brian Tyree Henry comes in and we have that dynamic, the pace starts to pick up, but that first half hour or so feels really long. And I guess what I want to look at when examining why that would be might be at Lawrence's performance, because Lawrence's performance is obviously what's right at the center of this. And overall, I can say, like, now that I've seen the whole movie, I can say that I like Lawrence's performance. But these early scenes, it was like, they feel very stiff and unnatural, and right away, you can say, well, it's the character. Because the character obviously has PTSD, just came back from Afghanistan, had a terrible brain injury, and is recovering from that. So it seems obvious why Lawrence would play this role the way that she's playing it. But because I understood so clearly, the movie helps you see so clearly how the character got to this point. Where it talks extensively about her being in Afghanistan and what happened over there, that the fact that the performance still seemed really weird and unnatural to me, even knowing what she's been through, makes me wonder if the performance was completely executing that in the most effective way. And it's like, so maybe it's not the character, maybe Lawrence's performance was just unnatural in the first half hour or so. But as she goes on, and like I said, she starts to find her way, it became very easy to want to see her find her way, and then that's when you start to see the strength of Lawrence's performance and how she's able to get the audience there to where, like, even if you might be kind of put off by her or the performance at the start, that you do quickly come around and want to see her, you know, find her place or make a friend or, you know, work in positive ways towards her recovery. Because obviously one of the things really beating this down is her insistence that she's going to go back over there as soon as she can. There's some really good scenes with Stephen Henderson as her doctor, who's just bluntly advising her against this. And you see these characters in her life like Henderson or Jane Addishaw, where it's like these characters that really care, like they're in the position of a job, and she's in their care, but the fact that that they're not just dismissive of her and she's not just another person they work with, is something that brings out a real humanity and just like the side characters in this, and brings something here. And obviously, Brian Tyree Henry, who I love, and he is very good here. I do think it's the characterization and like the writing, that I don't know is doing him much favors. And there's a few reasons for this. Number one, it just feels very like there's really barely a character here. They give in like, the tragic backstory, but it's like when you pretty much only give a character a tragic backstory, there's only so much an actor, even an actor as great as Henry, can do with that. So like there's moments where he tells the story of this car accident that he was in, and it's, strong enough. But it's the writing that feels like it's sort of not doing this character justice or giving this character much more. And that's the thing too, is you could say like, oh, it's the subtlety. It's like it doesn't have to be very spelled out who this character is and all that. And it's like, well, for starters, it's actually pretty spelled out who the character is and why he's here. The question is that it stops there. And it's like, oh, he's a good actor, he'll make it work. Is essentially what it seems like it's asking of him. And he can handle a monologue very well, because it's like, when you look at Brian Tyree Henry and like If Beale Street Could Talk, like, it's insane that Atlanta exists. I feel like I'm pretty sure Atlanta's the first place that I saw him, or at least definitely for sure the first place I really took note of him, where he's like a lead character on that show. But when you say Brian Tyree Henry's name, I swear to God, the first thing that always pops into my head is his monologue scene in If Beale Street Could Talk. And that's like his only scene in that movie. And that movie is like over 2 hours long. That's crazy. That's how well he can handle a monologue, and that's how well his acting by itself can really stand out and leave an impression. That one scene in one movie is the first thing I think of anytime I hear his name. But like I said, this only goes so far, but I think another way the writing doesn't treat this character as respectfully as it could is that I don't want to say too much, but I was really loving the relationship between him and Lawrence as it went on, and I was writing down here, I like this because there's not enough platonic relationships in movies. And it's like, that's what I was really digging about it. Like, there's something that's kind of casually dropped here about a character that immediately tells you, oh, this relationship is platonic. And I was really appreciating that, because like I said, it just seems like something movies are almost afraid of. Because it's like writers get so scared of just having a platonic relationship exist, and it's like, oh, but we need a conflict, there has to be some kind of romance or something. And it's like, while it's hard to call it romance exactly, it does also feel like it was too afraid to just, it was, like I said, the movie is so low-key, it felt like halfway through they were like, oh, we need a conflict, so they forced themselves into having this conflicting interaction between them that sort of breaks them apart. And it feels so forced. And to do that to this lovely platonic relationship is tragic. And I hated seeing that, because I felt like they really had something, and then it's like, oh, but it's, like I said, it was so obsessed at the beginning with feeling so real and having such individual moments, and then it's like, when they get to this point, it's like they were desperate to be a movie. So they just forced this conflict into it, and yeah, I just really wasn't a fan of that. And they complicate it, I guess you could say. And yeah, but on the side of that, we have other stuff that does work with how low-key they play it. Like her relationship with her mom. where it's like, there's not quite abandonment with her mom. Abandonment would probably be too strong of a word, but it's dangerously close to abandonment. Like there's always this distance between the two of them, to the point of impact. There's a distance with the mom, and where you could see like the sort of early points. You can imagine the early points in her life that maybe kind of led to certain struggles that she has now, particularly with building relationships. And there's just one scene in particular towards the end. It might be the mom's last scene, actually, which makes perfect sense narratively. Where it's like just when there's a connection forming, and the mother is very aware that a connection is kind of starting to form here. There's always something to like separate them. And it's like you kind of get this sense that that distance is always going to be there in this moment, without this moment having to really say anything too explicitly. And it's like I can see where the low key and the way they're using low key is working for this movie. But like that person said, to the point of non-existence does sound about right. Like I said, until it's existing too much, when they're forcing conflicts that probably don't need to be there. It's like, just, like, every time you think they should bob, they weave, and every time you think they should weave, they bob. It's like, it's almost there. It's always almost there. But it's always seems to just be missing what would make this movie great. To where it even goes below, like, really good, and it's just like, it's okay. Where it's like, these performances make it work enough, but they don't quite get it to across that line of being able to say, like, I highly recommend this or something. Because it does have a nice ending, but it was a really weird feeling, because even though the ending is nice, it's a nice sort of wrap-up and kind of brings the character to a good stopping place. It ends so abruptly. Do you know that feeling where like something's hanging over your head when you've started a movie but you haven't finished it? I felt that. Like when the movie was over and I was going about the rest of my day, I felt like I hadn't finished Causeway when I had. So that's, I don't know if that's the kind of thing you want to leave an audience with. Sometimes, like, there's the whole thing of leave them wanting more, but this isn't really that kind of movie. So, and like I said, it's a nice ending, and you get why this is the stopping point, but it still felt so abrupt. Like, weirdly abrupt. So, yeah. Like I said, there's a lot of times this movie is almost there, but it is probably too low-key for its own good at the end of the day, so. And, you know, it seems to like its characters, but doesn't quite go past a certain level with a lot of them, so there's that. So I guess that's how we can end this. So we'll continue getting caught up on a lot of stuff, doing awards stuff, and, you know, all the stuff you're expecting to see. I always assume people have probably tuned out by this point, so I don't even know why I go this far saying whatever's coming. I just feel like I'd be Causeway if I just kind of did this review and then just cut it off. Yeah, let's go ahead and do what Causeway did. Let's just cut it off right here.